Hi, this is Michael Leahy of the Irish Freedom Party. Have you wondered why young people in Ireland are finding it so difficult to acquire housing, to purchase a house, to own and occupy their own houses? At one stage, Ireland had the highest rate of home ownership in the European Union at well over 80%. This is one of the economic characteristics that defined us. However, in recent years, we have slipped back very significantly. We're now approximately at the median level of the European Union rates of home ownership. And we have been far surpassed by the states of the former Soviet Union. It may be that those countries, having lived through communism, realize the importance of property ownership in order to protect them from the state. In our situation, the levels of home ownership have dropped back, largely, in our opinion, because of the very high rates of taxation on new housing. It has been estimated by the Construction Industry Federation that as much as between 33 and 37% of the cost of a new house goes directly to government in terms of VAT, PAYE and PRSI on construction labour, levies, and so on and so forth, local authority charges, so on and so forth. This really is a very short-sighted policy because it's very important for people to be able to acquire property, to be able to look after their own houses. If they're houses which they own themselves, they will maintain them. Whereas if they're forced onto the local authority housing list, there will be an ongoing cost to government. The first thing we were proposed to do about this is to deduct VAT payments on any new house for a first-time house buyer. Why on earth should a young couple trying to start out in life, trying to put a roof over their own heads and the heads of their kids, be forced to pay a massive figure of 13.5% of the total cost of a house directly into government coffers? That simply does not make sense. Now, we want to advocate a break for the first-time house buyer whereby VAT is completely taken off. There are other charges also that we feel could be refunded, such as the cost in terms of a house of capital gains tax paid by the developer and certain levies, perhaps stamp duty. All of this must be looked at. Many, of course, will argue that doing this will cost the exchequer, but it's a very short-term cost because there will be a reduction in overall cost of the exchequer as people maintain their own houses. There's also an issue of mortgage interest relief. This was a standard mechanism used in previous years whereby young couples were given interest relief and tax relief on the interest payments that they made through their mortgages. This is due to be phased out this year. It was temporarily reinstated, but it's now due to be phased out. We in the Irish Freedom Party believe it must be maintained, and we will go further and say that there should be a double mortgage interest relief for all first-time home owners. This would effectively amount to a certain subsidy, but it's a small subsidy and it's well worth it. We must also look at the role of planning, regulations and planning government guidelines, which seem to be aimed at promoting very high densities. Now, these have often been criticized as being in the interests of the private sector, but they're not really. Most small developers do not want to promote high-density housing. They do not want to promote apartments because they find them very difficult to sell. And the reality is that high density only tends to suit large financial institutions such as banks and vulture funds, who are increasingly becoming the landlord class in Ireland. It may well be that this whole process of promoting higher density is feeding into the Agenda 21 agreement to which Ireland has signed up, where they're trying to promote, in the interests of what they call sustainable development, higher density living in cities. This is very short term. High density living is not the answer to all of our housing problems. Very often, high density apartments are not suitable for families. They may not be suitable for older people. And it's not appropriate that this should be the only housing model that we have. We should, in certain circumstances, such as the outer suburbs, facilitate the development of lower densities which are more appropriate to families. The importance of high density is probably becoming much less significant from an economic perspective, given the fact that many people are working remotely and many people are working from home. There's also an issue of the costs of building regulations. Building regulations, which are very useful in terms of providing an excellent product in terms of highly insulated houses, have also had a significant knock-on cost effect on modern housing and put them far beyond the reach of many lower-paid couples. We believe that to combat this, it must be necessary to introduce intergenerational mortgages, whereby somebody who purchases a house has the option of paying it back over perhaps 2 generations, perhaps a 50-year mortgage, and that this would be underwritten by government. It is appropriate, given the very high quality and standard of building which is now being provided, that people should not have to pay for it over a 20, 25 or 30-year period, that they should have longer to pay for it. Because after all, these houses are designed to last for 150 to 200 years, unlike previous buildings which were designed to last between 60 and 80 years. So it does make sense to allow for intergenerational mortgages to enable people to raise the capital to build a new modern house. We also find that in terms of renovation of existing buildings, building regulations all frequently make it impossible to renovate buildings for housing use. This has got to be looked at. We've got to have a separate building regulation code for renovating existing buildings. Many older people in particular would find living in old town centres, renovating old buildings would be a very appropriate way for them to end their lives. But it's not available to them because of the very high cost of renovating older buildings. These are some of the ideas that we have to try to ensure that housing becomes affordable again. We believe this is very important because you cannot have a participatory democracy where people are not dependent on the state unless there is a good level of property ownership among the population generally. Property ownership allows people to pass something on to the next generation and also provides a hedge for their retirement. So it is well worth promoting. We'd advise you to log on to our webpage, the Irish Freedom Party, to see many of our other policies, which I think you will find very interesting. I know that the left-wing media is trying to portray us as extremely right-wing, but this is not the case. The left often confuses the private sector at the small scale with private sector at the large scale. They seem to think that a small shopkeeper trying to put food on the table for his family is the same private sector as Microsoft or Allied Irish Bank. But they're very, very different. They have very different impacts on society. This has been Michael Leahy, Vice Chairman of the Irish Freedom Party. I'd advise you to log on to our webpage and find out more about our policies. Thank you for listening.